Have you ever felt the strange weight of a silence that doesn't belong? That eerie stillness that descends when the world loses someone it once cherished, not with fireworks or headlines screaming across every screen, but with a whisper, almost as if time tried to bury it before we had the chance to say goodbye. That silence fell heavy over Hollywood just days ago. A woman who once lit up living rooms across America with laughter and grace, whose golden hair and perfect smile masked a depth few ever truly understood, took her final bow. And yet, many never even saw it coming. There's something especially heartbreaking about a death that arrives before a celebration. Just days before what would have marked her 80th birthday, Loni Anderson, the unforgettable star of WKRP in Cincinnati, passed away. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't entirely unexpected by those closest to her, but it was deeply, painfully quiet. For someone whose image once graced magazine covers, billboards, and network television screens, the end came in a hospital room, removed from the bright lights that once adored her. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. To understand the weight of her passing, you first have to understand the glow of her life. Loni Anderson was more than an actress. She was a television archetype, a symbol of the kind of beauty America couldn't stop watching, but also a woman who constantly fought to be seen for more than that. She wasn't just the bubbly receptionist in a sitcom. She was a woman who navigated decades of sexism, reinvention, heartbreak, and personal turmoil, all while maintaining the poise of someone who knew the spotlight could turn off at any moment. But this isn't just another tribute. This is a journey. A revealing, emotionally layered look into how one of Hollywood's brightest stars rose, stumbled, recovered, and ultimately faded away, leaving behind stories that few dared to tell while she was still here. And by the end of it, you may just ask yourself how someone so visible could vanish with so little noise. It's important to remember that Loni Anderson's legacy doesn't just exist in reruns or autographed photographs. Her story echoes in the lives of every woman who ever had to smile through being underestimated, every celebrity who faced more headlines about their body than their brain, and every artist who had to fight twice as hard to prove they were more than just a face. But that fight didn't start in Hollywood. It began in St. Paul, Minnesota, where a young girl named Loni Anderson was born into a world that didn't yet know her name would one day shimmer across television screens. She was quiet, thoughtful, often self-conscious about her looks, believe it or not. As a child, she wore glasses, was painfully shy, and buried herself in books and dreams. There was no studio lot waiting for her, no red carpet, just the bitter Midwestern winters and a longing to be something, anything, more. She didn't grow up thinking she'd be famous. In fact, she once said that her original dream was to become a teacher. But even then, there was something about her that drew attention. In high school, classmates began to notice the way she carried herself, her intelligence, her poise. And when she began entering beauty pageants, not for vanity, but for college scholarships, her transformation began. There's a fine line between identity and image. For Loni, that line blurred early. She knew how the world saw her, and she knew how she wanted to be seen. In many ways, the struggle between those two versions of herself would follow her for the rest of her life. The sultry blonde who could stop traffic. The whip-smart woman behind the role, constantly fighting for better scripts, more respect, and fewer assumptions. By the time she reached Hollywood, she wasn't just another pretty face walking into casting calls. She was strategic, polished, and determined. But for every door that opened, 3 more closed. Producers often wanted someone less smart, less ambitious, more compliant. Loni was none of those things. And so, for years, she played the game. She accepted small roles. She smiled when told to. She endured countless auditions where her talent was ignored the second she walked in. Then came one fateful casting call, one that would change everything. It was the late 1970s, and CBS was launching a new sitcom, WKRP in Cincinnati. A quirky workplace comedy centered around a struggling radio station filled with misfits, idealists, and eccentrics. The show needed someone to play Jennifer Marlowe, the station's receptionist. But not just any receptionist. She had to be stunning. She had to be sharp. She had to defy the dumb blonde stereotype and flip it on its head. The role was tailor-made for Loni Anderson. Or perhaps Loni had been tailor-making herself for that role all along. What followed was television magic. Jennifer Marlowe became iconic almost overnight. With her signature look, dry wit, and unwavering composure, Loni didn't just play a role. She challenged an entire era's perception of what a beautiful woman could be on TV. She wasn't the punchline. She was the smartest person in the room. Audiences loved her. Critics respected her. And for the first time, Loni Anderson was not only seen, she was heard. But fame, as it often does, came with a price. As her career soared, her personal life began to strain. The tabloids hounded her. Her relationships became public property. Every wrinkle, every fluctuation in weight, every red carpet moment was scrutinized. She became an image as much as a person, a symbol of glamour, but also a target of criticism. She wasn't just fighting to stay relevant. She was fighting to stay real. Over the years, Loni's life became a series of transformations. From actress to advocate, from wife to single mother, from sex symbol to survivor. She took on causes close to her heart, especially lung disease awareness after her father's death. She raised her son with fierce love and quiet determination. She spoke candidly about aging in an industry obsessed with youth. And through it all, she kept smiling, graceful, resilient, and unapologetically herself. But behind that smile were years of struggle few ever saw. Battles with health, the ache of fading fame, the reality of watching roles dry up as the industry moved on. Yet, she never turned bitter. Instead, she found strength in reinvention. She kept working, writing, showing up, even when the world had already written her off. Now, with her gone, a strange silence has replaced the laughter she once brought into millions of homes. It's not just the absence of a person, it's the absence of a presence. One that made people feel seen, entertained, and even understood in ways they didn't expect. What happened in those final days? What did her family say in those last moments? Was there something she wanted to share with the world before she passed? And why did her death, just days before such a milestone, go unnoticed by so many? These are the questions we'll begin to unpack as we explore the story of Loni Anderson, an icon who lived her life in layers far deeper than the television screen ever showed. Her journey is more than just a rise and fall. It's a testament to what it means to fight for your place, to reinvent your path, and to leave behind more than just memories. She may have left quietly, but her story still echoes loudly, if you know where to listen. In the snow-covered stillness of St. Paul, Minnesota, in August of 1945, Loni K. Anderson came into the world. Not with the roar of destiny, but with the quiet curiosity of a child who would one day be forced to become more than what the world expected. Her early years were far from the glamour that would later define her public image. There were no red carpets, no studio lights, no limousines. Just small-town sidewalks, the scent of pine and old bookstores, and the gnawing awareness that she didn't quite fit in with the rest of the world. Loni was not born into privilege. Her father, Clayton Carl Andy Anderson, was a chemist. Her mother, Maxine Hazel, was a model who had once aspired to an entertainment career of her own but gave it up to raise a family. Loni grew up in a modest, middle-class household where education was respected and dreams, while encouraged, were not always indulged. She was quiet, introspective, and by her own accounts, socially awkward. She had dark hair then, and wore thick glasses. Her posture slumped from years of shyness. There was nothing yet about her that suggested she would become a national symbol of television glamour. But beneath that shy exterior was a deep well of ambition, unspoken, but slowly growing. She wasn't the prom queen. She wasn't the girl all the boys chased. In fact, for much of her childhood, Loni struggled with a profound sense of invisibility. She often felt more comfortable in libraries than in cafeterias, more drawn to poetry than parties. Her peers looked past her, and the few who did take notice rarely saw beyond the surface. The irony is that decades later, Loni would be fighting to reverse that exact pattern, but in the opposite direction. Back then, she wanted to be noticed. Later, she would want people to look deeper. Her first escape from that world came through the arts. Music, drawing, drama. These weren't just hobbies for her, they were lifelines. In high school, she began to participate in plays, discovering a surprising confidence when she stepped into other people's skins. On stage, she wasn't the shy girl anymore. She was someone bold, someone articulate. The transformation was almost chemical. Her voice no longer trembled. Her hands no longer fidgeted. For the first time, she felt powerful. Around the same time, Loni began entering beauty pageants, not because she saw herself as particularly beautiful, but because she saw them as a strategic opportunity. Winning a local pageant could mean scholarship money. And for a family without the financial cushion to fund college, that mattered. To participate, she made changes. She began experimenting with her appearance. She dyed her hair lighter. She wore contact lenses. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and began learning the complicated dance of public image. It was during this time that Loni began to understand the power of perception. She saw firsthand how differently the world treated her as a blonde versus a brunette, with glasses versus without. She learned how quickly people would form opinions, assign value, and make judgments based on appearance. It was both empowering and terrifying. On one hand, she could control how others saw her. On the other, she realized how easily substance was ignored for surface. Despite her growing awareness of how the world worked, Loni stayed focused on education. She enrolled at the University of Minnesota and majored in art. But her real passion was performance. She took theater classes, performed in college productions, and steadily built a reputation as someone with a quiet but undeniable magnetism on stage. She was still the girl from St. Paul, but now she carried herself differently. There was confidence in her walk, thoughtfulness in her delivery. It wasn't vanity. It was evolution. College wasn't just an academic experience for Loni. It was a turning point. For the first time, she began to seriously consider acting as a career. The idea was frightening. The odds were brutal, but something in her couldn't let it go. She knew she didn't fit the mold of most aspiring Hollywood actresses. She wasn't brash or scandalous. She wasn't from California or New York. She didn't have connections, but she did have drive. She had the discipline, the patience, and the ability to study people the way artists study landscapes. After graduating, she took a leap few in her hometown would have dared to imagine. She packed up and moved west, toward California, chasing something intangible: opportunity, visibility, change. What she found, at first, was rejection. Audition after audition, casting call after casting call, doors kept closing. Sometimes they didn't even let her in the room. She was told she was too pretty for serious roles, too serious for comedic ones, too old for ingenues, too unknown for leads. The contradictions piled up like bricks. But Loni didn't fold. She observed. She listened. She learned the rhythm of the city, the way agents spoke, the way producers played favorites, the language of resumes and headshots. And then she made a decision that would quietly change everything. She transformed her image. She leaned into the very stereotype she had once resisted. She became the blonde bombshell, but with a twist. She would wear the look like armor, but she would never let it define her. This was not a woman content to be decoration. She studied comedy. She rehearsed dramatic monologues until they landed like punches. She worked side jobs and accepted tiny TV roles in procedural dramas, game shows, anything that would get her on camera. She learned how to stand out even in a three-line part. There was no instant breakthrough, no fairy tale success, just slow, gritty persistence. It was a time of contradictions. On one hand, Loni was becoming more polished, more Hollywood in appearance. On the other, she was sharpening her mind, her technique, her sense of what she wanted to say. This duality, beauty and brains, glamour and grit, would become the defining paradox of her career. And yet, few knew how hard she was working behind the scenes to make it all seem effortless. Her personal life during these early years was no less complex. She married her high school sweetheart, Bruce Hasselberg, and had a daughter. But the marriage was short-lived. The strain of balancing motherhood with a struggling acting career in an unforgiving city proved too heavy. Loni would carry that guilt for years, even as she built a new life for herself. Her relationship with her daughter remained a private cornerstone of her strength, even as she rarely spoke about it publicly. Looking back, those early years in California weren't glamorous, they were grinding. They were filled with long casting waits, rude dismissals, and moments of real doubt. But Loni endured. Not because she was delusional or desperate, but because she genuinely believed she had something unique to offer. She wasn't just trying to be seen. She was trying to be understood. And perhaps most significantly, during this period, Loni developed the resilience that would carry her through the highest highs and lowest lows of her later fame. She learned how to smile through disappointment, how to navigate a room full of people who didn't take her seriously, and how to stay grounded when the world around her was built on illusion. By the time the 1970s rolled around, Loni Anderson was no longer the shy girl from Minnesota. She was a woman with a clear vision, a carefully crafted image, and a deep, often unspoken hunger for something more than just stardom. She didn't want to be famous for being famous. She wanted to matter. She wanted to create characters that left a mark, and she was willing to wait as long as it took. That wait would soon end. The thing about rejection in Hollywood is that it doesn't always sound like a slammed door. Sometimes it comes in the form of a smile, a polite handshake, or an empty promise. It's subtle, constant, and corrosive. For Loni Anderson, the years leading up to her breakout role were saturated with these quiet rejections. There was no public humiliation, no headline that screamed failure. Instead, there were countless days where she walked out of auditions wondering if anyone had truly seen her. In the mid-1970s, Hollywood was a complicated place for women. The industry still clung to outdated tropes, feeding actresses roles that recycled the same tired stereotypes. If you were blonde and beautiful, you were given a script with lines that rarely required more than a flirty giggle. If you were older, you were often ignored altogether. And if you were smart, visibly, vocally smart, you made people nervous. Loni, somehow, was all three. She was beautiful, yes, striking even. But she was also deliberate in her delivery, articulate in interviews, and fiercely aware of how the industry functioned. She had started to understand the uncomfortable truth that being pretty in Hollywood could be both a ticket in and a trap. It opened doors, but those doors often led to cages labeled with other people's expectations. So she began reinventing herself, not by becoming someone else, but by carefully choosing what parts of herself to emphasize and when. She refined her look. The dark hair of her early years gave way to a golden halo that caught the light of cameras better. She took inspiration from the pin-up icons of previous decades, studying the way Marilyn Monroe used posture and tone to control a room. But she also studied Lucille Ball, Carole Lombard, and other women who made comedic brilliance look effortless. Loni wasn't trying to be one thing. She was trying to be everything the industry said couldn't exist in one woman. Glamorous and grounded, sexy and sharp, funny and formidable. Television became her proving ground. The medium was booming, and while major film roles remained elusive, guest spots on TV shows gave her small opportunities to be seen. She appeared on series like SWAT, The Bob Newhart Show, Barnaby Jones, and The Love Boat. In each appearance, she played characters that hinted at more than what was written on the page. She brought nuance where none was required. She made forgettable roles linger in people's minds. Still, for all her hustle, stardom remained just out of reach. She wasn't landing leading roles. She wasn't headlining anything. And her name wasn't yet one people remembered. Casting directors would nod, thank her, and move on. Agents weren't calling her first. She was, at best, a well-dressed question mark in a town obsessed with exclamation points. And then, in a twist of fate so Hollywood it almost seems scripted, everything changed because of a photograph. Loni had taken a promotional photo in a red swimsuit. It wasn't provocative by modern standards, more suggestive of 1950s glamour than 1970s shock, but it caught the attention of Hugh Wilson, the creator of a new CBS sitcom about a struggling radio station in Ohio. He was looking for someone to play Jennifer Marlowe, the station's receptionist. The role wasn't originally supposed to be a focal point. It was written as a standard supporting part. But Wilson saw something in that photo, something poised, intelligent, composed. He saw Jennifer. When Loni was called in to audition, she didn't just read the lines. She embodied them. She understood instantly what the role required, and she made a bold decision. She would not play the receptionist as an airhead. Instead, she leaned into calm authority. Her Jennifer didn't flirt, she commanded. She didn't giggle, she charmed. She wasn't wide-eyed, she was whip-smart. Executives weren't convinced at first. The network had imagined someone more traditionally bubbly, less statuesque, perhaps more submissive. But Hugh Wilson pushed back. He insisted Loni had the kind of screen presence that couldn't be taught. She didn't just fill the screen, she anchored it. Eventually, they relented. And just like that, Loni Anderson became Jennifer Marlowe. What followed was nothing short of alchemy. WKRP in Cincinnati debuted in 1978, and while it was an ensemble cast, Jennifer quickly became the show's secret weapon. Audiences were drawn to her, not just because she was beautiful, but because she surprised them. Episode after episode, Jennifer defied expectations. She was always the smartest person in the room, yet she never had to raise her voice to prove it. Loni infused the character with dignity and restraint. She played her not as a caricature, but as a woman who had learned to use the assumptions people made about her as a tool rather than a burden. In many ways, Jennifer mirrored Loni's own experience in Hollywood. Both had learned how to navigate rooms full of men who underestimated them. Both had turned charm into control, and both had built identities on layers few people bothered to peel back. The public response was immediate. Fan mail flooded in. TV critics praised her timing, her composure, her presence. Loni was nominated for 3 Golden Globes and 2 Emmy Awards during the show's run. For the first time, she wasn't being told what she couldn't do. She was being asked what she wanted to do next. But with success came scrutiny. The tabloids began circling. Suddenly, every aspect of her life was public property. Reporters speculated about her relationships, her surgeries, her weight. Photographers waited outside her home. Her private moments were twisted into headlines. And while the world saw a woman who had finally made it, behind the scenes, Loni was beginning to feel the cost. Hollywood doesn't like when a woman gets too much power on her own terms. And Loni was proving she could succeed without compromising her values. She refused to pose for Playboy. She pushed back against scripts that made her character one-dimensional. She turned down roles that didn't challenge her. And every time she said no, the industry took notice. WKRP lasted 4 seasons, from 1978 to 1982. When it ended, Loni had options. She could have leaned into typecasting. She could have chased more sitcoms. But she wanted to expand. She took roles in TV movies, dramatic miniseries, and even dipped into voice acting. She was careful about her choices. Too careful, some would later say, because while others chased visibility, Loni chased meaning. Still, she never apologized for being ambitious. She once said in an interview, "I didn't come to Hollywood to play the same role over and over. I came here to find out who I could be." That spirit of reinvention, of resisting the box she was so often placed in, remained at the core of everything she did. By the early 1980s, Loni Anderson had achieved what many actresses only dream of: critical acclaim, commercial success, and a character that became a cultural touchstone. But behind the glamour, the pressure mounted. To stay relevant, to stay beautiful, to stay employed in an industry that rarely made room for evolution. The road to WKRP had been long, winding, and painful, but it had taught Loni exactly who she was. And more importantly, it had taught her what she wouldn't be. When WKRP in Cincinnati first premiered in the fall of 1978, few within the television industry expected it to make a significant impact. It was, on paper, another ensemble sitcom about an eccentric group of co-workers fumbling through their day jobs. The backdrop was a struggling AM radio station, the kind of setting that seemed quaint even by late 70s standards. But television history doesn't always follow blueprints. And sometimes, one role, one performance, can elevate a premise into something unforgettable. For WKRP, that role was Jennifer Marlowe. And for America, that actress was Loni Anderson. From the moment she appeared on screen, Jennifer was magnetic. She wasn't loud or animated like some of the other characters. She didn't deliver rapid-fire punchlines or stumble through absurd situations. Instead, she was calm, poised, and almost unervingly self-assured. Her confidence was never forced. It floated through every scene like perfume in the air, impossible to ignore, yet hard to define. She had the ability to say little and mean everything. The audience noticed. So did critics. In a show filled with chaos, neurotic DJs, clueless management, on-air disasters, Jennifer was the axis around which everything else spun. And yet, her character could have easily become a joke. The receptionist role had, for decades, been written as either ditzy or invisible. It was the background character who delivered coffee, rolled eyes, and exited stage left. But Loni refused to let that happen. What she brought to Jennifer was subversive in the most elegant way. She was stunning, There was no denying it. But she never used her beauty as a weapon. Instead, it was a veil. People underestimated her, both in the show and outside of it. That gave her the upper hand. Every time a male character assumed she was just a pretty face, she would dismantle that assumption with a single raised eyebrow, a perfectly timed remark, or a silence that made others uncomfortable. Loni crafted Jennifer to be more than just a receptionist. She was the gatekeeper of sanity in a world of lunatics. She managed chaos with grace, kept egos in check, and, perhaps most importantly, never let herself be the punchline. She didn't chase men. They tripped over themselves trying to impress her. She didn't beg for respect. She commanded it with every word. The writing team quickly realized what they had in Loni. Scripts began to evolve. Jennifer's storylines deepened. She wasn't just there to look pretty behind a desk. She was woven into the fabric of the show's intelligence. She gave the audience someone to root for, not because she needed help, but because she was helping everyone else. Off-screen, Loni was experiencing something new and disorienting. Fame on a massive scale. Fans wrote letters by the thousands. Magazines requested photo shoots. Talk shows lined up for interviews. She became a fixture in pop culture, a symbol of class and quiet power during a time when television still tried to box women into two extremes, housewives or sex symbols. Loni was neither. She was something in between, real, complex, sharp. And yet, even as her star rose, she remained mindful of the cost. Fame came with strings. There were assumptions to correct, rumors to dodge, and public scrutiny to manage. Every red carpet appearance was analyzed. Every hairstyle became a fashion statement. Every interview became a potential headline. Loni handled it with the same grace she gave Jennifer, but it wasn't effortless. It took energy. It took discipline. And it took an unshakable sense of self. She understood early on that celebrity was a currency, and she was careful how she spent it. When asked to appear in revealing photo spreads or to take on roles that required nudity, she declined. When pushed by studio executives to lean more into this sexy blonde image, she pushed back. Not because she was afraid, but because she was strategic. She didn't want to become a caricature. She wanted to be remembered as someone who played the game by her own rules. Behind the scenes, Loni became a quiet leader. Though not the loudest presence on set, she was known for her professionalism. She arrived prepared. She respected everyone's time. She advocated for fair treatment, not just for herself, but for the women on the crew, the interns, the younger actresses who visited the set. She remembered what it felt like to be invisible, and she made a point of seeing others. Her dedication paid off. WKRP thrived in the ratings, became a cultural touchstone, and developed a loyal fan base that would carry on long after the series ended. But perhaps more than any other contribution, Loni changed what it meant to play the pretty girl on television. She flipped the script without making a scene. She didn't tear down the stereotype, she outsmarted it. It's easy now, decades later, to forget how revolutionary that was. Today's television landscape is filled with strong, multidimensional female characters. But in the late 1970s, Jennifer Marlowe stood almost alone. She was the first example many viewers had of a woman who could be stunning, witty, respected, and in control, all at once. And that's because Loni Anderson didn't just portray Jennifer. She built her, carefully, intentionally, with the precision of someone who knew how fragile public perception could be. But success, as always, came with a cost. As her visibility grew, so did the pressure to maintain it. She felt it in the way people stared, in the way they expected her to always be polished, always be perfect. She began to wonder whether people loved her or just the version of her they saw on television. That question would linger in her personal life, haunting her most intimate relationships and coloring the way she saw herself. Despite that, Loni remained focused. She didn't seek attention through scandal. She didn't crash parties or chase headlines. She stayed true to the quiet ambition that had carried her from a small town in Minnesota to national stardom. She knew who she was, and more importantly, she knew who she refused to become. In interviews during the height of WKRP's popularity, Loni often spoke about her fans with gratitude. She didn't resent the attention, but she did sometimes feel suffocated by the narrowness of it. People expected Jennifer Marlowe to walk off the screen and into the real world. They expected her to always be composed, always be witty, always be beautiful. Loni did her best to meet those expectations, but inside, she yearned to show more, to do more. Still, she remained grateful. She knew how hard she had worked for every moment. She knew how many roles she'd lost, how many scripts she'd turned down, how many nights she had cried in silence, wondering if the dream would ever materialize. And now here it was. Real. Tangible. Hers. When WKRP ended in 1982 after 4 seasons, it wasn't because the show had lost its audience. It was a mix of network reshuffling, scheduling conflicts, and internal politics. The cast was heartbroken. Loni, especially, felt a sense of unfinished business. She wasn't ready to say goodbye to Jennifer. But she also understood that endings in television are rarely graceful. They happen in boardrooms, not on sets. Still, the role of Jennifer Marlowe left a permanent mark on her life and on American television. It opened doors, yes, but it also set a standard, one that Loni would spend the rest of her career trying to meet or, more often, trying to escape. Because being Jennifer was both a gift and a trap. It made her famous, but it also made people believe they already knew her. And Loni Anderson, as the world would soon learn, had many more layers than anyone expected. For millions of Americans, Loni Anderson was the epitome of television glamour. She had that unmistakable blend of radiance and restraint, able to brighten a screen with her presence while still holding back just enough to maintain a sense of mystery. By the early 1980s, her image was everywhere, on magazine covers, talk shows, red carpets, and calendars. Jennifer Marlowe may have been a character, but to the public, the line between the role and the woman had begun to blur. And with that fame came expectations. Expectations that she would always look the part. Expectations that she would always be poised and delightful. Expectations that she would never show fatigue, sadness, or frustration. But behind the carefully constructed public image was a woman who was beginning to feel the weight of it all. Fame isn't something most people prepare for. It doesn't come with a manual. It arrives suddenly and swells without warning. Loni had worked hard for her place in Hollywood, but nothing prepared her for the scale of exposure she would endure. Fans wanted pieces of her, autographs, photos, a moment of recognition. And while she appreciated their love, she couldn't help but feel like she was becoming less of a person and more of a product. The days were long, the appearances endless. There was always a new shoot, a new interview, a new event. Even weekends were booked. She'd leave one set only to change outfits in a car on the way to the next engagement. Her schedule was a never-ending rotation of wardrobe fittings, hair and makeup appointments, promotional obligations, and rehearsals. It was dizzying and exhausting, but the most taxing part wasn't the physical grind. It was the emotional toll. Every time she appeared in public, she was expected to deliver the version of herself the world adored. There was no room for off days. No space to be quiet or withdrawn. She had become a symbol, and symbols aren't allowed to be human. The media didn't help. At first, reporters wrote glowing pieces about her elegance, her humor, her on-screen charisma. But as the novelty faded, the coverage shifted. The same outlets that had once celebrated her began to dissect her appearance. Was she gaining weight? Was her skin changing? Had she had work done? Headlines became more invasive. Paparazzi stalked her. Anonymous sources whispered about her marriages, her moods, her looks. And no matter how gracefully she handled it, it wore on her. In private moments, she often questioned what success really meant. She had the fame, the recognition, the fan mail. But she was also more scrutinized than ever before. She couldn't step outside without a layer of armor. And worst of all, she couldn't trust easily. People seemed more interested in what she could offer than who she truly was. It was during this time that Loni began to feel a deepening sense of loneliness. She had friends, certainly, colleagues, admirers, acquaintances, but intimacy became scarce. How do you form authentic connections when everyone's looking at you like a trophy? How do you relax when the moment you let your guard down might become tomorrow's headline? At the same time, Loni was also navigating the difficult transition from a supporting ensemble member to a leading woman. Producers started offering her top billing in made-for-TV movies and miniseries. And while the scripts often didn't match the depth she longed for, she took some of the roles anyway, partly for the challenge, and partly to prove she could carry a story on her own. These roles gave her a chance to show a different side: drama, emotion, vulnerability. She portrayed abused wives, heartbroken mothers, ambitious women fighting impossible odds. She brought rawness to the screen, even when the budgets were low or the stories melodramatic. Critics didn't always praise the projects, but they often praised her. She brought credibility to otherwise forgettable scripts. And she kept working, not out of desperation, but because acting remained her lifeline. Still, not all of these projects fulfilled her creatively. Some felt like vehicles to maintain her visibility rather than meaningful contributions to her career. The entertainment industry, especially in that era, often viewed television actresses as disposable once their most famous show ended. Loni knew that clock was ticking, and it terrified her. She was also facing a battle that every aging actress eventually confronts in Hollywood: the erasure of opportunity. Roles for women over 40 were scarce. Those that did exist were often written as bitter ex-wives, overbearing mothers, or background characters. Gone were the dynamic leads, the nuanced characters. Unless you were willing to dramatically change your appearance or reinvent yourself entirely, you risked being forgotten. Loni refused to disappear quietly. She embraced her age with dignity and challenged the notion that beauty had an expiration date. In interviews, she pushed back against the idea that actresses had to retreat from public life as they got older. She acknowledged the pressure, but she didn't bend to it. If she chose to have cosmetic procedures, she did so privately and without apology. If she declined to do so, she did it with the same autonomy. She wasn't trying to be anyone else's version of herself. She was trying to stay in control. That inner fight, to remain whole in an industry that thrives on breaking people down, defined much of this phase in Loni's life. She had money. She had fame. But she also had doubts. Was she being appreciated for her talent or her looks? Did her fans truly understand who she was beneath the Jennifer Marlowe sheen? Could she ever escape the legacy of WKRP and be seen as more? Her personal life added to the pressure. Relationships became more complicated. Intimacy came with strings. Men who pursued her often fell in love with the idea of her, not the woman herself. She longed for emotional honesty, but found that vulnerability was a liability in her world. When she did fall in love, it was often under the microscope. When those relationships faltered, the blame, unfairly, was often placed on her shoulders. By the mid-1980s, the fatigue was undeniable. Not just physical, but spiritual. She began pulling back from the spotlight more often. She declined interviews. She stopped attending as many events. She began seeking peace in quiet moments, away from flashing bulbs and scripted charm. Yet even in her most private reflections, Loni never lost her spark. She still laughed easily. She still gave herself to causes that mattered. She still found joy in small things: sunlight on her skin, handwritten letters from fans, a good line in a bad script. She knew that her best work might still be ahead of her, and she was willing to wait for it. The fatigue she felt wasn't just about overexposure. It was about trying to keep pace with a version of herself the world had frozen in time. The Jennifer Marlowe who had captivated millions was still there, but she had grown, and she needed the world to let her grow. Fame doesn't shield anyone from heartbreak. In fact, it often amplifies it. For Loni Anderson, love wasn't a fairy tale tucked neatly into a Hollywood ending. It was a series of high-stakes gambles, each played in the public eye, each marked by the tension between private longing and public perception. She was admired by millions, adored on screen, and photographed constantly. But behind the camera flashes and polished appearances, her personal life unfolded in complicated, messy chapters, full of hope, misunderstanding, and the kind of sorrow that lingers long after the headlines fade. Loni's first marriage was not the kind most Hollywood stories are built on. She married her high school sweetheart, Bruce Hasselberg, when she was just 21. It was a decision born more of familiarity and youthful optimism than romantic inevitability. At that time, she was still living in Minnesota, working toward an education degree, and only beginning to entertain the idea of acting professionally. The relationship was sincere but short-lived. Within 2 years, it unraveled under the weight of mismatched ambitions and mounting responsibilities. They had one daughter together, Deidre, and the divorce was handled quietly, before Loni became a household name. Raising Deidre as a young single mother in a competitive industry was not easy. Loni kept much of her daughter's life private, fiercely protective of her from the encroaching media. She didn't want her child to grow up under the scrutiny she would later face. In interviews, Loni rarely spoke of her role as a mother, not out of distance, but out of a need for sanctuary. Her love for her daughter was one of the few parts of her life untouched by performance. Years later, as Loni's star began to rise through her role on WKRP, love entered again. This time with all the intensity, passion, and complexity that only Hollywood could provide. In 1981, Loni Anderson met Burt Reynolds. The relationship was electric from the start. Burt was already a legend, rugged, funny, wildly charismatic, and one of the most bankable stars in the world. Loni, on the other hand, had just reached the peak of her television fame. Together, they were the ultimate power couple, two impossibly good-looking, successful entertainers seemingly made for red carpet photos and magazine covers. But what appeared picture-perfect from the outside was, from the beginning, rooted in contrasts that would eventually drive them apart. Burt was wild, unpredictable, prone to dramatic mood swings and impulsive decisions. He was deeply private in some ways, yet constantly surrounded by noise. Loni was more measured, thoughtful, and sensitive to the emotional turbulence around her. Where Burt sought freedom, Loni sought structure. Where he laughed things off, she processed them. Their connection, intense and magnetic, was built on chemistry but struggled with compatibility. Still, for years, they tried. The media followed their every move, romanticizing their union and speculating on their intentions. When they married in 1988, it was treated as a Hollywood event. Flashbulbs erupted, interviews were given, and fans hoped it would last. And for a brief moment, it seemed like it might. They adopted a son, Quentin, and for a while, there were glimpses of domestic peace. Loni devoted herself to motherhood again, this time older, wiser, and more seasoned in navigating the spotlight. Quentin became the center of her world. She stepped back from certain roles, prioritizing family over career, trying to create a life that didn't revolve around scripts and studio lights. But behind the scenes, the marriage with Burt was unraveling. There were rumors of infidelity, financial disputes, and emotional manipulation. Burt's career was beginning to decline, and his struggles with painkillers and depression made their home life volatile. Arguments were frequent. Communication became a minefield. And eventually, the love that once drew them together turned sour. Their divorce, finalized in 1994, was one of the most bitter and publicized separations in celebrity history at the time. Allegations were traded. Accusations flew. Legal battles ensued. Burt claimed Loni was obsessed with her image and fame. Loni accused Burt of being emotionally abusive and unfaithful. The media feasted on the drama, turning their private pain into public entertainment. But while Burt seemed willing to air grievances publicly, Loni remained comparatively reserved. She didn't take the bait. She made a conscious effort not to demean him in the press, even as he continued to make headlines with inflammatory remarks. When asked years later about the divorce, she reflected with a clarity that revealed both pain and forgiveness. "We should never have been married," she once said. "We were attracted to each other's strengths, but we didn't know how to navigate each other's weaknesses." Through it all, her commitment to Quentin never wavered. She shielded him as best she could from the ugliness of the split. She made a decision early on that their son would not become a pawn in a war of reputations. While others gossiped and speculated, Loni focused on being a mother first. In the years following the divorce, Loni avoided serious relationships, focusing instead on rebuilding her sense of self. The experience with Burt had left her wounded but also wiser. She began speaking out more about issues that mattered to her: women's rights, the pressures of aging in Hollywood, and the double standards that plagued actresses throughout their careers. Eventually, love returned, this time in a quieter, more enduring form. In 2008, Loni married Bob Flick, a founding member of the folk group The Brothers Four. Their connection was rooted not in publicity, but in a long-standing friendship that dated back decades. Bob had known Loni before the fame, before the flashbulbs, before the storms. Their relationship was marked by a deep understanding and mutual respect. With Bob, Loni found something she had rarely experienced in her romantic life: peace. They didn't chase the spotlight. They didn't pose for covers or stage interviews. They built a private life filled with music, laughter, and the kind of contentment that doesn't need to be photographed to be real. Loni often described Bob as her rock, someone who grounded her, saw her for who she was, and loved her through every chapter. Looking back at her romantic journey, one might be tempted to frame it in terms of failures and successes. But Loni never did. She didn't see divorce as a defeat. She saw it as a difficult choice in pursuit of peace. She didn't let public opinion define the worth of her relationships. She learned, adapted, and continued to believe in love, even when the world tried to convince her it was too late. Her experience taught her compassion for herself and for others. It made her more patient, more forgiving, and more open to the idea that people are complicated, imperfect, and deserving of second chances. In many ways, the most remarkable thing about Loni Anderson's love life wasn't the drama, it was the grace. She loved deeply. She hurt quietly. And when it was time to let go, she did so with her head held high. It's easy to remember Loni Anderson for the way she lit up the screen. The way she walked into a scene and held the room with nothing more than a glance or a carefully measured line. But behind the television glamour, behind the headlines and the marriages and the magazine spreads, there was a quieter story unfolding. A story that didn't make the front page, but shaped who she truly was. That story was about motherhood and service, and a kind of strength that didn't come from performance, but from persistence. Long before she was a television icon, Loni was a mother. Her first child, Deidre, was born during her early 20s, a time when she was still piecing together her dreams in the modest shadows of Minnesota. At a moment when most young women are still trying to figure out who they are, Loni was raising a daughter. She hadn't yet arrived in Hollywood. There were no agents or auditions, just diapers, sleepless nights, and the unrelenting pull of responsibility. She would later describe those early years as formative. Not because they were easy, but because they forced her to grow up quickly and prioritize someone else's needs over her own. Raising a child while trying to start a career in entertainment is not for the faint of heart. And for a woman in the 1970s, the challenges were multiplied. The industry wasn't kind to women with children. Casting directors often assumed mothers couldn't commit to the brutal demands of production schedules. Managers advised women to hide their maternal status to avoid being passed over. Loni faced all of that. But she didn't hide. She protected. She shielded Deidre from the prying eyes of the press and kept her out of the spotlight, not out of shame, but out of a deep need to preserve something real and untouched by the artificial glitter of fame. She carried that same protective instinct years later when she adopted her son, Quentin, with Burt Reynolds. By then, her career had fully matured. She was a household name. Her face was instantly recognizable. Her every move was tracked. And yet, in the middle of all that noise, she carved out a space where she could simply be a mother. Adopting Quentin was not a publicity stunt, though some in the media were quick to speculate otherwise. It was a choice made from a desire to give love to a child who needed it, and to build a family at a time when her own life was swirling with uncertainty. She took her role as a mother seriously. Despite the chaos of her marriage to Burt, she remained unwavering in her devotion to Quentin. Even when their divorce turned ugly, she refused to allow her son to become a casualty of their personal war. She was, by all accounts, a deeply involved mother. She cooked, she read bedtime stories, she took him to school when her schedule allowed, and when it didn't, she made sure he never felt forgotten. She wasn't perfect, no parent is, but she was present. Even during her most visible years, when she was working nonstop, she made a point to keep her children grounded. No amount of television fame could compete with the quiet satisfaction she found in being needed, in being loved without condition. And yet, despite all she gave at home, Loni didn't limit her compassion to her family. In the late 1990s, her life took another turn, this time shaped by grief and a growing sense of purpose. Her father passed away from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a condition often linked to smoking. The loss devastated her. He had been a grounding figure in her life, a steady hand who supported her journey even when it veered into unknown territory. His death left a void, but it also lit a fire. Loni took her pain and turned it into action. She became an advocate for lung health, partnering with national health organizations to raise awareness about smoking-related diseases. This wasn't a one-time appearance or a token cause she lent her name to. It was personal. She threw herself into the work, educating others, appearing in public service announcements, speaking at events, and using her fame to amplify a message that might otherwise be ignored. Her advocacy wasn't flashy. She didn't need it to be. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was trying to prevent other daughters from experiencing what she had. She used her platform to talk about secondhand smoke, to challenge misconceptions about lung disease, and to promote healthier environments, not just in homes, but in workplaces, schools, and public spaces. Over time, she expanded her philanthropic efforts. She supported causes related to child welfare, education, and women's health. She volunteered, she fundraised, and she gave quietly. There were no camera crews following her to hospitals or charity events. She didn't ask for praise. She just showed up. And the people who worked alongside her, nurses, social workers, parents, remembered her not as a celebrity, but as someone who genuinely cared. In many ways, her life's second act was less about performance and more about presence. The camera didn't define her worth anymore. Her family, her causes, her quiet contributions, they did. She embraced that shift. It gave her a new kind of confidence, one that didn't need approval or applause. And still, she found ways to return to acting, not to chase relevance, but because it was part of her DNA. But when she took on new roles, there was a different energy to them. She didn't need to be the star. She didn't need the spotlight to linger. She chose projects that interested her, characters that challenged her, even if they weren't glamorous. And every time she stepped back in front of the camera, she did so as a woman fully aware of what mattered most beyond the screen. In interviews, she occasionally spoke about aging, not with bitterness, but with insight. She understood the anxiety that many women in Hollywood faced as they got older. She had felt it herself, the narrowing of opportunity, the judgment, the fear of invisibility. But rather than fight against it, she chose to redefine what aging gracefully could look like. She talked about the pressure women feel to stay young, to compete with newer faces, to erase every wrinkle. But she also talked about the joy of being fully herself, of not needing to play the game the same way anymore. Her words resonated with many who had followed her journey. She wasn't lecturing. She was sharing what she had learned the hard way. Motherhood and advocacy gave Loni Anderson a dimension the entertainment industry never quite understood how to frame. She wasn't just a star. She was a nurturer, a fighter, a woman who had been bruised by fame, but never broken by it. Her strength wasn't in her image. It was in her persistence, her integrity, her ability to show up for the people and causes she cared about long after the cameras stopped rolling. She was a mother who protected her children's privacy in an era when tabloids spared no one. She was an advocate who turned grief into purpose. And she was a woman who never stopped learning, never stopped evolving, and never stopped giving, even when the world expected her to fade quietly into nostalgia. Hollywood is a machine that rarely waits. It's always reaching forward, always searching for the next face, the next story, the next thing to sell. For women, especially those who built their careers on youth and beauty, the arrival of middle age often signals a slow, cold fade-out. Not because their talent disappears, but because the roles do. In the 1990s, Loni Anderson felt that silence begin to settle in. After the dizzying heights of the 1980s, Loni's presence on screen began to shrink. She wasn't in demand the way she once had been. Offers trickled in, but they lacked the depth or dignity she deserved. Where once she had been the breakout star, now she was being asked to reprise, to parody, or to play roles that bordered on self-mockery. For a woman who had fought so hard to control her image, this shift was disorienting. The phone didn't ring as often, and when it did, it was often for cameos meant to wink at the audience's nostalgia. Television producers wanted her to play herself, not the real Loni, but the version people remembered from tabloids and sitcom reruns. It wasn't malicious. It was simply the way the industry operated. You became a brand, and once the brand stopped selling, it got repackaged or shelved. But Loni was never the kind of person to accept irrelevance quietly. If the roles weren't coming, she would find new ways to express herself. She began exploring behind-the-scenes work. She considered writing. She took meetings that had nothing to do with casting and everything to do with content. She knew her voice still mattered, even if it wasn't being amplified by others. Still, the adjustment wasn't easy. There's a peculiar pain that comes with being recognized everywhere and yet, professionally, being seen less and less. People on the street would still call out her name, still remember lines from WKRP, still ask for autographs. But in the executive rooms of studios, she had become a footnote. She wasn't alone in this. Throughout the 1990s, actresses from her era faced similar erasure. Many were quietly pushed out. Others reluctantly conformed to roles that felt beneath them. But Loni didn't want to settle. She didn't want to become a caricature of her former self. She wanted to evolve. One of her most strategic returns to television came in the form of a guest role on A Melrose Place, where she played Terry Carson, a manipulative mother with dark secrets. The role was different, edgier, more morally gray than anything she had played before. It gave her a chance to tap into emotions that hadn't been explored on sitcoms: bitterness, regret, calculated cruelty. It wasn't a huge part, but it gave audiences a glimpse of what she could do outside the confines of comedy. Later, in the early 2000s, she appeared in The Mullets, a short-lived sitcom where she played the mother of two outrageous brothers. The show didn't last, and critics gave it little attention, but for Loni, it was another opportunity to work, to play, to laugh. Even if the material wasn't groundbreaking, she approached it with the same professionalism she had always carried. Still, she knew these roles weren't what they used to be, and the question began to loom. Was there any room left in this industry for a woman like her? Loni's answer came not from television, but from within. She began to accept that fame had seasons. There was no shame in stepping back. She didn't need to be on every screen to prove she still mattered. She had already made her mark. Now, she could choose when and how to return. In this quieter phase of her career, she became more selective. She turned down offers that felt disrespectful. She avoided reality TV, despite numerous requests. She declined memoir deals that would have forced her to reveal more than she was comfortable sharing. She understood the value of privacy in a world that had tried for decades to strip it away. Instead, she focused on what gave her joy. She traveled more. She spent time with her children and her husband. She attended charity events and lent her name to causes she believed in. And when she did appear in public, she did so with elegance, not out of obligation, but because she chose to. For Loni, reinvention didn't mean changing who she was. It meant shedding what no longer served her. She didn't chase relevance. She redefined it. She didn't cling to the past. She honored it, then moved forward. That mindset was evident in how she spoke during interviews at the time. She was reflective, not bitter. She talked about aging not as a burden, but as a filter, something that stripped away superficiality and revealed what really mattered. She acknowledged the disappointments. She mourned the roles that never came. But she also expressed gratitude for having had the career she did. By the end of the 1990s, Loni Anderson was no longer in the tabloids every week. She wasn't the headline at every awards show. But she was still working, still creating, still living on her terms. And in many ways, that was more powerful than any spotlight. She had learned how to pivot, not just professionally, but emotionally. She wasn't chasing the version of herself that had captivated America 2 decades earlier. She had evolved into a woman who understood that visibility didn't equate to worth. And in that understanding, she found freedom. Hollywood's cold shoulder never froze her. It only reminded her to warm herself with what really mattered: family, integrity, purpose. And though the cameras rolled less often, the essence of who she was remained brilliantly unshaken. Aging in Hollywood is a paradox wrapped in performance. On the one hand, it's inevitable. On the other, it's treated like a scandal. For male actors, the march of time often brings gravitas and new opportunities. For women, it can feel like a slow, unspoken cancellation. One moment, you're the centerpiece of a show. The next, you're invisible. Loni Anderson was no stranger to this uncomfortable truth. And when the 90s turned into the 2000s, she found herself in the center of a new kind of spotlight, one not fixated on her talent or accomplishments, but on her face. People weren't asking what roles she was playing anymore. They were asking what procedures she'd had done. The scrutiny was relentless. Her photos, especially those from red carpet events or public appearances, were analyzed with surgical precision. Rumors spread like wildfire. Did she have a facelift? Botox? Fillers? The tone was rarely inquisitive, it was accusatory, as if aging, or resisting its visible signs, was a betrayal of some unspoken contract she had signed with the public. It didn't matter that Loni had never claimed to be ageless. It didn't matter that her focus had long shifted to family, advocacy, and selective roles. All that seemed to matter was whether or not she still looked like the woman America fell in love with in 1978. Loni didn't often respond to these critiques, but when she did, her answers were pointed and clear. She never denied that she cared about her appearance. She was in an industry where image had always been part of the equation. But she pushed back against the narrative that women who chose to age on their own terms, whatever those terms were, deserved to be mocked, dissected, or dismissed. She acknowledged that she had made choices to maintain her look, but she refused to apologize for it. In one particularly candid interview, she said, "I've always taken care of myself. I work out, I eat well, and yes, I've had help. But that doesn't erase who I am or what I've done. I'm not hiding anything. I'm just trying to feel good in my skin." That statement cut through the noise in a way that few others did. Because it wasn't defensive. It was honest. She wasn't trying to pretend she hadn't aged. She simply refused to let age become the only thing people saw when they looked at her. Still, the press wasn't always kind. Magazines would run unflattering photos with snide captions. Online tabloids used before and after comparisons like weapons. Television pundits would make casual jokes about her appearance, always with the same toxic undertone. She looked different, and that somehow meant she was lesser. But if Loni had learned anything over her career, it was resilience.